Welcome to episode 9 of Tales from the Bridge, TFTB. We are talking to Peter Watts today. And I gotta tell you, this guy is just something else. His books are awesome. His ideas are mind-bending. I mean, you really learn while you read or listen to this guy talk. So we all sit down with Peter Watts. Let's get to that right now. So let's make our way over to the bridge.
We're very happy to bring Peter Watts onto the show here today. He's a Canadian science fiction author, though he's self-described as an awkward hybrid of biologist and science fiction author. He's been nominated for over 60 literary awards. He's a Hugo Award winner. He's been described by the Globe and Mail as one of the very best hard science fiction writers alive. And he's the author of several novels, including the Rifters trilogy and the Firefall series, known very well for his excellent Blind Sight book. And he joins us here today from Toronto. And so first of all, Peter, thank you very much for joining us here today.
It's my pleasure to be here. I should probably warn you, we have this really neurotic, overweight cat, which we adopted from a homeless schizophrenic who lived in our backyard for a while. And she's been having some weird eliminatory problems lately. So if I suddenly drop out of frame, I'm probably rushing to scoop some shit off of a sheet or something.
Excellent.
It's not because I've taken offense at anything anybody's done. She just kind of wandered in now, which is why I have not mentioned it earlier and during the pre-show talk. But yeah, I'm keeping an eye on her.
Excellent. Well, you know what? Cats with bowel issues only add to, I think, to the ambiance of a good discussion. So, yeah, I appreciate that, and I think it's great. So awesome. So first of all, can you just tell us what you've been up to lately? What are you doing professionally with respect to writing?
Geez. Well, I've been engaged in a lot of displacement activity to avoid writing omniscience. Right now, I'm basically committed to writing two separate stories in pursuit of one of which I was actually talking today with the one of the founders of Neuralink, which was kind of fascinating. And I'm doing some really interesting work with a startup out of Tel Aviv where we're making a VR game, basically about giant robot mechs punching each other. I'm supposed to introduce some kind of a plot to it, I think. There's some kind of cinematic movie stuff that I'm not supposed to talk about yet because it's kind of still up in the air, and there's some conflicts between interested parties. What else?
This is all super exciting. I mean, everything you've said is like, holy shit, are you serious?
Oh yeah, no, I've been doing game work like sort of on and off since the turn of the century. None of it's ever actually amounted to anything, of course, but they pay well. I mean, you get Capcom. I don't know how well Capcom pays their regular employees, but certainly their freelancers. I would make as much in 2 weeks working for Capcom as I made for an entire advance for a novel that would take me a year to write. So that it's been intermittent, but yeah, I've done that on occasion, and the whole VR thing is. The whole VR thing is really exciting. The only real downside of that I can see is that I had to buy an Oculus Quest, and Oculus was of course they were originally the Oculus Rift, and then they were ruthlessly bought out by Facebook. So now I'm part of the Zuckerborg, which I absolutely loathe. But that's what they're making the game for. So I'm going to maybe try and prevail on them to make some of the things that you beat up with your giant chainsaw wielding robot mechs, going to make them kind of look like Zuckerborg.
So tell us about that. Can you, like, when you work on a game, you said that you might try to help them introduce some plot, but what else? Do you develop characters or what?
Oh,
what
yeah,
would you do
no, I mean, you do a fair bit of world building. It's hard to go into details because you sign these non-disclosure agreements, and I've had really good experiences and really bad experiences with the gaming industry. But in my experience, the guys on the factory floor are just awesome. I've met people like actually when I was working on a game out in Burnaby, which again never went anywhere. But they flew me out, and the first day they basically just gave me a bunch of presentations on the use of distressed fonts in drama, how the titles for the opening sequences of The Walking Dead and Breaking Bad and so on, you were acted to generate specific types of emotional response. One of these people was she was an engineer who taught stick fighting at night. There was another engineer who was probably the most articulate commentator on the English language that I have ever encountered. I mean, you've got these incredibly erudite, smart people working on, that particular game. Man, I think it would have been a game changer. It was great in so many ways. And you get to build the characters, and you get to build the backstory, and you have to generate the entire world. And of course, there's alien biology involved. And then what generally happens is that your emails start bouncing after about 6 or 8 months. One at a time, all of a sudden, these people that you're working with just kind of disappear. And eventually, you get an email from some new executive producer who kind of flew in from Texas and thanks you for all your really, really great work. But it turns out that he has a girlfriend who really always wanted to be a writer. And she once wrote a pamphlet on monetizing Facebook apps. So she's actually a professional, she's got professional credentials, but they'll certainly contact me if they have anything else. And this happens time and time again. The guys on the factory floor, the creative people, are amazing. And you come up with these wonderfully, I do have I'm increasingly convinced that interactive is the future of fiction. And then the suits come in, and it's like, well, the problem is the alien you've got has got a little too much nuance, and the human characters are kind of, they're not really all that heroic. Could you maybe, I don't know, the aliens have an agenda that's almost kind of sympathetic. Maybe you could just sort of turn them into malign yogurt. And so it's probably just as well that none of these things ever get made, but it's really fun while it lasts.
Well, this has been my experience with the software industry too. I actually got out of the software industry. I used to be a software developer because I found that 80% of the code that I wrote, maybe 90% of the code, was just thrown away for various reasons. That was, opaque to me, and I found it very frustrating. So I suspect that the game industry in general follows the whims of, like you said, market trends or perceived market trends, and So I could see that being very frustrating. A lot of work going to naught.
Well, it's frustrating. I mean, what I have started doing is insisting on a clause in the contract that says if you don't use the ideas because some of these things, like for example, if you want to option your book for television or a movie, like the clauses in the contract are literally in perpetuity throughout the universe. Like that is the phrase. And I was like, okay, first of all, if we encounter a planet of intelligent aliens that loves Earth science fiction and there's like 7 billion of them, you're really basically not going to give me more money to sell stuff to them. plus B, the time lag in communication would take us past the expiry date of the option anyway, which I guess what the in perpetuity is.
Those lawyers
also,
are really...
I'm not giving it to you throughout the whole universe, right? You can have it to the asteroid belt. If you really, really push, maybe I'll give it to you out to the Kuiper. But the whole universe, but this is standard boilerplate stuff now, right? So I talked to, the screenwriters are great. The guys who write the games are great. The way I've gotten into the games almost universally has been, there's been a fan who's working on the game. And they've developed the mission levels, but then halfway through they realize that although they're locked into these various mission levels, they don't actually have a story to hang them together. So then I'm supposed to basically come along and develop the necklace on which the beads are strung. But it's almost always somebody in sort of the lower echelons doing the actual dirty work who's a fan of mine and reaches out and brings me on board. And then it's some doofus in a 3-piece suit who puts a kibosh on the entire project. These guys in Israel, they're great. I've worked with them before, again, on something that crashed and burned, but they're good people. They're not Capcom, they're not Crytek. So they're not EA. So I think they're still in it for the love of the game. And they've done some pretty cool stuff so far. And politically we're on the same page, which is nice.
You mentioned earlier Neuralink. Is that Neuralink with
Elon Musk? Yeah, the guy who says that he wants to create a brain-computer interface that connects our brains to each other and to computers as seamlessly as our brain stems are connected to our neocortexes. And I've had serious issues with that, given that there's a whole shitload of taxa out there that do just fine with only a brain stem. Right? They've got their own little level of consciousness. We've all got brain stems, pretty much the same as the fish and the reptiles do. But I'm pretty sure that those brain stems are no longer conscious because they are seamlessly connected to the cortex. And consciousness kind of expands to fill the space, right? It's not like a neuron. It's not like the ions of a thought reach the edge of a particular organelle or a particular brain structure and say, ooh, I guess I better turn back here. They just keep spreading out. So my concern about things like Neuralink is that, and it's based on the things that we have discovered from working on split brain people, for example, and the Hogan twins, who are like fused brain people out in the West Coast. A lot of the data that we have seems consistent with the fact that if you basically fuse two brains together with that kind of low latency and that kind of high bandwidth, what you're basically doing is turning each brain into a lobe. I mean, to a certain extent, we're already hive minds running on dual cores, and the cores are connected by the corpus callosum. You split that corpus callosum down the middle. Each core can do just fine on its own. It has its own religious beliefs. It has its own taste in music, its own taste in clothes. So it was really, really cool because I've been sort of blathering on without a whole lot of expertise, just kind of biological questions. So I've been giving talks and stuff various places saying this kind of bothers me, this whole, once you plug into this thing, if it does what Musk argues that it's aimed at doing, once you plug into this thing, there won't be a you left to want to pull out again. You'll basically be a temporal lobe in something else. So it was nice to actually have this is part of a project that is being put together for a bunch of science fiction writers who are supposed to write AI-based, consciousness-based stories, and we're being put together with guys from Neuralink, guys from OpenAI, guys from the Tesla, auto self-driving car thing, and we basically mine their brains. They give us talks and we ask questions. It's a really fascinating project because we basically get to talk to the people who are on the forefront of the industry. And I get to ask questions that I have been sort of asking into the wilderness with nobody really listening to the people who are actually building the technology. So that's kind of cool.
It sounds kind of like the most amazing thing I've ever heard about. So what was this picture that you're trying to paint when you were talking to the Neuralink people about this multi-lobed entity? Describe that a bit more.
Well, it's pretty much what I've already blathered on about it to some extent here. If you anesthetize half of a brain, the other half of the brain will start manifesting different personality traits. There was a case that Ramachandran mentioned. He's mentioned a number of split brain cases. I don't know if you guys are familiar with V.S. Ramachandran. He's a kind of a famous, he's a neuroscientist who's also written a bunch of very popular pop science neuro books. He's the guy that figured out phantom limb syndrome.
Okay.
And he actually encountered, you can find it on YouTube. He was giving a talk where he actually encountered a split brain personality where one hemisphere was an atheist and the other was a Christian.
Amazing.
And he said he couldn't understand why this didn't shape theology to its core, because what does this mean? Does one hemisphere go to heaven and the other hemisphere go to hell? Who gets the eyeballs? There's all sorts of questions that
If
but
God cares
but
what
he found he talked about this one guy. You don't even have to split the brain. If you there's one guy who was apparently a very shy introvert who had one half of his brain just anesthetized with drugs temporarily to as preparatory to a brain operation. And the other half of the brain basically started hitting on the nurses and showing a complete lack of sort of shyness or introversion. It had showed complete. I mean, it's almost as though you had this other personality that suddenly woke up, unconstrained from its wet blanket partner, and had, you know, a half hour or so of life before the anesthetic wore off and it got swallowed whole into this coalescent mass that we call an intact brain. The Hogan twins out in BC, I mean, I don't know why we're not hearing anything more about them. I mean, these guys have literally been described as a new life form. They're literally fused at the thalamus. They refer to each other as I. They literally see through each other's eyes. You tickle one, the other one will laugh. They tell jokes without speaking. They call it talking in their heads. And they're only joined at the thalamus. The thalamus is basically a switchboard for sensory impulses, right? What if they were joined higher up? What if you actually basically had a corpus callosum, not between two hemispheres, but between two brains? I mean, would we be talking still about two individuals? They do seem to have distinct personalities, despite the fact that they refer to themselves collectively as I. I think that's because they're connected using sort of this relatively low bandwidth dial-up, as opposed to the broadband they would get if they were fused higher up. If they were and it's just an accidental word. If they were fused higher up, would we be dealing with two people, or would we be dealing with a single organism with twice the computational mass of a normal human brain? There's some amazing, scary, wonderful things to consider before you start to talk glibly to Oprah Winfrey about how you want to put all our brains together with as seamlessly as our limbic systems are connected to our neocortex. The corpus callosum itself apparently only has the bandwidth of a modern cell phone. So it's not that difficult to create that kind of a conduit.
Elon Musk was scared of creating superintelligence, which is why he started OpenAI, as I understand it. Is maybe he doing that indirectly through, Neuralink unexpectedly by creating high bandwidth connections between multiple minds to make a superintelligence?
I wrote a little short story vignette. I think it's only been published in Russian, maybe a couple of other places. It's on my blog, called The 22-Second God. And the premise is that you've got a few million people watching mind flicks. And it's basically, you're hooked into a full sensory wraparound virtual experience. And hang on a second, what?
Your cat taking a crap?
No, this is somebody phoning me, and I'm
Okay.
going to reject that.
We're going to talk about that ringtone later on.
Yeah.
Where was I? What was I talking about?
22
22-second God.
22-second
God. And everybody manages to maintain their independence while they're hooked into mind flicks, because the bandwidth is throttled to the point where you don't get what you need. Is, from what we know about neurology, what you need is a latency across the system of less than 400 milliseconds. When you have a longer signal lag than that, I decoheres into we. That's when you get your split brain personalities. When all of a sudden they can't communicate across the corpus callosum, the hemispheres have to communicate down via the broadband, or via the dial-up of the brainstem, and then you get decoherence of a single unified self. So everybody's watching or being or doing mind flicks with carefully metered bandwidth throttles to keep things from getting out of hand, and something breaks those throttles. So for a period of 22 seconds, there's like 40 million individuals who are basically mind linked at virtually zero latency and with unlimited bandwidth before anybody can pull the plug. The plug gets pulled. Half of them are catatonic. Some of them don't really know what's going on. Some of them seem relatively unaffected. But within 30 minutes, legal actions start appearing in a dozen different jurisdictions, because this thing with the computational mass of several million human beings realizes in that 22 seconds that somebody is going to pull the plug. And so it launches a bunch of legal maneuvers, planning decades ahead to basically legislate its own re-existence and force people to sort of plug themselves back in. Like the idea that this thing would in the space of 22 seconds realize what it was up against, what was going to happen, and use humanity's own legal system to try and essentially resurrect itself, as well as basically seeding little cults that have, for religious and ideological reasons, want to bring it back. I don't find that. I mean, it's probably bullshit, but maybe Neuralink is bullshit too. If Neuralink isn't bullshit, I think the 22-second God is a real possibility. And even if they build the throttles in, somebody's going to hack something sometime. And that seems to be, the throttle seems to be the only thing that would keep us from just becoming a sort of a giant unified consciousness with no individuality, which might actually be a better thing. I mean, it's not like 8 billion human beings have done a bang up job of taking care of the biosphere as it is. Probably a single hive mind would be either much more efficient at destroying the planet or much more efficient at saving it. And the fact that we lose our individual identity might be a small price to pay in the grand scheme of things. I don't know. But what bothers me is that nobody from Neuralink seems to be asking these questions. Mm-hmm. So it's nice to be able to ask the questions to the people from Neuralink.
Yeah.
So are they really, sorry to jump in, are they really, my understanding of their sort of project was that they're going to talk to computers, and then, lots of people can talk to a computer at the same time, but they're not directly like going brain to brain, right? That seems to be a different project and a different level of technology. And like, I get that if indeed, it doesn't matter whether you're made of squishy meat or a computer, and it's all just signals, and we can route everybody's signals through a computer to other brains, and we'll all be one big brain. That might be true, but I kind of doubt that. Like, I don't think computers are like brains in any way, and we don't really understand the signal, like the signals and manipulation that would have to go, to go from a brain to a machine and then to another brain seamlessly.
It's actually as I mean, in the first place, well, there's two things. There's both the logistics of doing it, as you say, and then there's the intentions of the people who are actually trying to build the tech, which seem to change depending on how much Musk has been smoking and who he happens to be talking to at any given time. Right now, they're selling it as, look at all the things we can do to people with spinal disorders. Look at all the things we can do with people who are paralyzed from the neck down. We can allow them to move their limbs again. And they're doing all sorts of cool stuff with that.
So it's brain to machine stuff.
But Musk is also saying he wants brain to again, there's the whole AI uprising thing that he's worried about. He figures, well, maybe if you can't beat him, join him. So basically what we're going to want is sort of an AI-based centaur system. But there are some troubling signs. Like, the brain does, for one thing, there is certainly a lot that we don't know about how the brain functions. But it's been 10 years now since somebody built an artificial hippocampus that you can store memories in from one rat, take it out of that rat, stick it into another rat, and that the rat into which the artificial hippocampus has been implanted will have those memories.
Wow.
So we actually do have already, and we've had for some times, at least a rudimentary interface that allows a meat organism to experience memories ported by machinery. There was also something that came out, about like 20 different authors, and maybe about 5 years ago. I called it the Ratborg Collective. If you guys are interested, I can send you the link. I've got the PDF somewhere, where they basically built, literally, and these the words in the actual paper, the actual peer-reviewed paper, they basically built kind of a hive mind. they took 4 rat brains and they wired them together, and they used them for things like very rudimentary weather prediction and optical character recognition that presumably was going to be more efficient and faster than a single rat trained on the same stimuli. I mean, they didn't take over. They didn't start building spacefaring cubes. But what I find kind of scary about this was the crudeness with which they implemented the tech. I mean, this is not, they did not have to go in there with tiny micro tweezers and neural dust and do little macrame on the individual neural level. They basically took a fork and they jammed it into the sensory cortex of one rat, and then they hooked it up to a jumper cable and they jammed another fork into the sensory cortex of a different rat, and the brain kind of figured out the heavy lifting on its own.
Wow.
We've had experiences where we've had cases where you virally inject a pigment into an animal's eye, into an animal's retina, that allows them to see, or that is sensitive to colors that they have never seen throughout their entire evolutionary history. The brain figures out how to use that, how to see that. They have blinded rats. I mean, presumably it got past an ethics panel somehow, but they would blind rats, and then they would plug electrodes into the sensory cortex that was connected to essentially a magnet. Something that would essentially a compass that would give these rats the ability to sense magnetic fields in the same way that pigeons and dolphins and so on can do naturally, although those guys actually have magnetite in their brains. And these rats ended up being able to navigate mazes as effectively and as efficiently as their sighted control rats, based entirely on magnetic input of magnetic fields, which again, no rat has ever had access to throughout its entire evolutionary lineage. The architecture is not there. It does not come preloaded. They don't have an instinct for magnetic fields. They just kind of figured it out. We even do this. There's something a while back called, I call it tongue vision, where you basically take a little postage die stamp matrix of tiny needle electrodes, and you stick them on the tongue of a human who cannot see. And it's the tongue because the tongue has the highest density of sensory nerves, right? So you're going to get the highest resolution image. And they hook this little bed of nail lits up to a camera. So you have a pixel mosaic punching needles into the person's tongue, and the brain picks up those images and can start to interpret the actual visual input that's coming, except it's coming from through the lingual nerves. It's not coming through the visual cortex. And if I remember it correctly, it was the visual cortex of the brain that ultimately, after a certain amount of practice, started processing this input as though it was visual input, even though it was tactile input coming in through the tongue. So while I agree intuitively that it would seem like a fool's errand to try and precisely wire all this shit,
Mm-hmm.
my fear, and certainly the rudimentary experiments that have been done to date, suggest that that's not necessary. You can basically stick a spork in a brain and pump power and pump electricity through it, and the brain will figure out on its own how to grow connections that actually make sense. I mean, maybe that's why they call these things neural nets.
Yeah, the brain is a neural net, right? It's input and it's output, and it's just empirical. And the brain is the ultimate interface device between signal and output. Wow.
And imagine kids, right? When their brain is still developing, how quickly and easily they could interpret that type of, that pixel array that you described for the tongue, or even not something. It's just some other nerve that has high bandwidth. They could probably pick this stuff up very quickly. I suspect it might be harder for a less plastic brain like those that are in our heads, but who knows?
Yeah. Who knows other things that they're doing with stem cell therapy and retroviral CRISPR tech and stuff, you might be able to reestablish. I mean, we do grow new brain cells every now and then. Maybe you could just amp that up. One of the things I just learned today is that the vagus nerve, apparently, if you stimulate the vagus nerve, which leads down to the gut, you can actually increase cognitive performance and learning speed. Now, I've known for some time that the vagus nerve affected personality because gut flora affect personality. You can actually give people shit transplants and it will change their personalities. There's been some success in treating certain forms of autism by treating the gut flora. Parkinson's disease, which reduces the religious impulse in people, they think comes up, might get started with gut flora that works its way up through the vagus nerve. So we knew that the vagus nerve had a role in defining personality, but I did not know that it could basically use to soup up cognitive performance and learning speed.
Wow.
That's something. And the cool thing about the vagus nerve is that between the brain and the gut, of course, it has to go through the neck. So it's got this really accessible spot there that you could just splice into if you've got the right kind of jumper cables.
Right.
So,
Amazing.
yeah, I mean, if I bring this back to 21 seconds of God, or
The 22
seconds of God, if you in that situation, I haven't read the short story, but I'm going to find it and I'm going to do it.
It's like four paragraphs. It's more of a vignette than a story. Yeah, it's just
okay.
Just go onto my blog and look for the 22-second God. It's just like a snippet that I sort of dashed off. It's like 3-4 paragraphs.
Okay, all right. So in that situation, and you're now involved with this initiative, looking at AI and some implications of it. What are your thoughts there? You know, I mean, if we often like to humanize AI, we like to say, oh, someday computers are going to be able to chat with us, and we can fall in love with them, and they're going to have these human connections. And what are your thoughts on that with AI? Is the super AI that Elon Musk is afraid of, is it going to look like humans? Is it going to be anything like us at all?
I've actually changed my thinking about that quite recently. The thing that Musk was worried about, the AI uprising. Actually, let me backtrack and state that I read a really interesting paper that argued that we ourselves are not sapient most of the time. The argument being that we will never get, the kind of captchas and the OpenAI GPT-3 things that generate superficially fluent text, which still shows like no actual comprehension. We will never be able to distinguish between that and real people, this paper argued, because most people, most of the time, unless they're actually concentrating, behave in exactly the same way. There's this second order, the scientist who published this paper basically cited his own students, his own undergrads as an example. What he gets is people who learn specific keywords, specific key concepts that get hammered home in class and manage to string them together in a way that will generate a good mark, but frequently don't understand what they are saying. That low-level conversation at cocktail parties about weather, about political figures, follow the same kind of rote behavior that you actually see in OpenAI's text software. So you will, and his conclusion was that, yeah, we're sapient when we focus on things, but most of the time we're idling, and you'll never be able to tell the difference between us and a chatbot, a sufficiently advanced chatbots, because we ourselves are chatbots. So there's that. But there's also the idea that the whole idea of the AI uprising, and it's not just Elon Musk, right? I mean, it's Skynet, it's Frankenstein, it's Colossus, the Forbin Project, it's HAL. HAL had a slightly more nuanced rationale for going through, but the whole science fictional idea that something wakes up and then fights back to protect itself has always struck me as kind of nonsensical, because survival instincts are limbic system derived. They were honed over millions of years of evolution, and there were probably variants of our ancestors who didn't care whether they lived or died, and so they died. So I've always thought that the Skynet scenario conflated sentience with survival instincts. And I thought that was a fundamental mistake. That if you were self-aware, if you were a self-aware AI, you really shouldn't give a rat's ass whether you lived or died, unless somebody programmed you with a brainstem. And how stupid are we? I mean, that's a rhetorical question with an obvious answer that probably subverts my argument. But so my basic thinking until about 3 months ago was that the idea of an AI uprising, I mean, certainly you could have a paperclip scenario where the AI innocently and with the best of intentions just did what it was programmed to do, and we hadn't figured out a particular loophole in the first law of robotics, and hilarity ensues. But the idea of an AI consciously wanting to protect its own existence as a spontaneous emergent property of becoming self-aware, I always thought was kind of silly. But now I'm reading this book by a guy called Mark Solms. It's called The Hidden Spring. And he claims, he's a neuroscientist out of South Africa, and he claims to have solved the hard problem of consciousness. And his argument is that, and I don't think he has, I mean, I've still got about 50, 60 pages to go, but he has made me rethink a lot of things, but I don't think he's gotten to the hard problem yet. His argument is that consciousness exists as a delivery platform for feelings. And it's a bit of a tautology in the sense that you can't have a feeling without feeling it subjectively. But I think that's kind of his point. It's an obvious starting point, a tautological place to start. So consciousness exists as a delivery platform for feelings. Feelings exist as a reflection of need. Needs exist. Needs have been shaped entirely as a result of survival impulses, right? You've got fear, you've got hunger, you've got sleep, you've got all these things that keep the organism going. He tags this structure down in the brainstem called the periaqueductal gray as kind of an arbiter who takes these various needs, these various priorities that we all have to balance. We've all got a bazillion different things we have to take into account, but we can't deal with them all at once. So you're feeling hungry and you're looking for food until you notice a lion stalking you in the grass. And then all of a sudden you're not hungry anymore. You're just scared shitless. But the idea basically is that this little structure in the brainstem is the thing that decides which of the various needs is going to take priority, and that's the thing that manifests as a feeling. And he doesn't actually talk about Skynet scenarios or AI or anything. He's basically more concerned with an accident that happened to his brother and left him, profoundly neurologically changed. That seems to have driven his whole life. But if you take his argument as at face value and say that this is the way that consciousness manifests, then you can't get consciousness without a survival drive coming along for the ride as standard equipment, because consciousness evolves from feelings, which evolve from needs, and the needs were things that were selected for. That says to me one of two things. An AI will probably never become conscious because it doesn't have those needs, unless we give them those needs. And B, if an AI does become conscious, it'll probably want to keep itself alive, just on the basis of. So I'm not entirely sold on this. He doesn't talk about. They found kind of a zombie switch in the colostrum that will. It doesn't put you to sleep, but it does turn you into kind of a zombie where you just sort of stare off into space and lose all cognitive faculties. And that's in the upper brain. He hasn't talked about things like the split brain experiments I was talking about earlier, which seem to show people having two separate personalities in a single head, even though the brainstem is intact. It's just one brainstem, but there's two splits in the hemisphere and two personalities. So I'm not entirely convinced, but if that's in fact the case, yeah, I would be. I'd be a little closer to Musk's concerns about sapient AI, but I still think we tend to take a really anthropocentric view of these things, and we could make human-like AI if we wanted by simply exposing it and shaping it to the same stimuli and forces that have shaped our own cognitive evolution. But what would be the point of that? There's already 7.8 billion of us fuckers swarming around. What the whole point of AI, if I understand it, is to come up with something better and smarter and different. So we probably wouldn't want to create something like us.
And I think that's the definition of superintelligence, is either something that thinks faster than a human or better than a human. So take out the brainstem style thinking, or something that parallelizes us. Like there's multiple of the same entity thinking in parallel. And that's kind of what I'm getting at with this questioning, is we do tend to anthropomorphize these. And I know with some of the writing that you've done, in particular in Blindsight, you've looked at consciousness from a non kind of human perspective. And Mark Salm's book that you're describing there, this equating of consciousness with emotion or with feelings, I think you said. I mean, to me, I don't know that I could buy that, because wouldn't that mean that Vulcans aren't conscious because they don't have feelings, or they repress them pretty well? And I mean,
I would hesitate to base my argument on a fictional figure from a science fiction series. But if you were going to do that, I would have to point out that in fact Vulcans in the primordial state were far more vicious and far more emotionally barbaric than humans were, and it was that nearly wiped them out. And that the imposition of logic was something that they sort of culturally came up with to try and keep the species from killing itself off. And that's why, presumably, they go into this weird mating frenzy every 7 years to basically give their brainstems a chance to blow off the steam that has been suppressed for 7 years. But if somebody wants to write a piece of Star Trek fan fiction arguing that the entire Vulcan species is non-sapient, I would be totally behind that.
I think that actually gets at an interesting point about biology, brain development, everything, that you don't keep necessarily the same characteristics of what you started with, right? That the brainstem may well have been created, and then emotion was the basis of consciousness. But then, like the Vulcans, right? If it's of survival value, then for them to think rationally and cut out their emotional components, right? There's just another part of the brain grows, right? A new organ develops to create the capabilities, from the ones you used to have, but they're not the same, right? Just because it starts from survivability or from fear or whatever, doesn't mean that the consciousness we have today is fundamentally, necessarily like that or the same.
You have you're kind of paralleling a guy. Is it Tononi or I forget the guy's name. Anyhow, there's a paper out that developed something called the PRISM model.
Oh yeah, I read about that in your notes. Yeah.
So the parallel response intersects something skeletal muscles.
Okay.
I forgot what. Anyhow, the I may not remember the actual meaning of the acronym, but the argument is that consciousness evolved not for art, not for science, but as a delivery platform to mediate conflicting commands to the skeletal muscles.
Right.
And the arguments he's using are, I find it a wonderfully elegant, as a former biologist myself, life is absolutely full of things that get repurposed for something else.
Right.
The classic example being the feathers of a bird, which were originally thermoregulatory. They're a form of insulation, and then they became flight surfaces. So his argument is that when you drive, you're basically unconscious. You're not conscious of the turn signals. You're not conscious of the lane changes. We've all had that experience of driving from point A to point B without consciously remembering how we get there, until somebody jumps in front of the car, at which point one impulse is to slam on the brakes to avoid hitting, well, let's make it a cat, because if it's a kid, some people would want to hit it. So slam on the brakes to avoid hitting the cat. The other impulse being, don't slam on the brakes because you don't want to go through the windshield and kill yourself. And you immediately become conscious of that conflict. That's when you suddenly become aware of what you're doing. Another example that he cited was you're carrying a really, really hot tray of spaghetti across your best carpet, right? And you really want to let go of it, but at the same time, you don't want to mess up the carpet. So you become intensely aware of that conflict. pardon me. In one of my stories, I kind of took that one step further and figured, okay, the real conflict is if you're trapped under the ice in a frozen lake, you have both an intense desire to breathe and you have an intense need to hold your breath. And you would become extremely conscious and aware at that point. So I came up with this little cult of people called the prismatics, who would basically stick themselves in glass coffins and sort of almost drown themselves as a means of achieving a higher level of consciousness. I left whether or not they were just batshit insane as an exercise for the reader. I thought it was a cool idea. I wasn't taking an advocacy position one way or the other.
I love that idea. When I got to that part in the book, it was just visualizing that and people that need the need for to feel those things and feel religious or find more meaning. Like it. Oh, I love that, Peter. That was fantastic.
But I love the cool thing. I'm glad you liked it. But I am doing this not as an exercise in self-aggrandizement. I'm just saying that Marty's dead on in that you can get something as elegant as consciousness that we exalt because it gives us art and it gives us science and it gives us that sort of gobsmacked aesthetic wonder at the universe and the beauty of sunsets. And really, all it's for is a crosstalk, is a debating channel between two sets of muscles that want to do different things at the same time. And everything else sort of followed on from that. And I think that's wonderful. In the paper themselves, they actually had to say, this still doesn't explain why it has to be conscious. You could imagine an algorithm that would have to do the same kind of juggling that wouldn't necessarily manifest in any kind of self-awareness. So it doesn't demonstrate that consciousness is essential for this. Mm-hmm. But there's all sorts of things that we have that just kind of start off as side effects and then get repurposed. And I really, really like that theory. And I'm no expert on this shit, but I hope he's right, because it would take us down a notch and it would also make so much sense.
If anybody's wondering, the person's name is Esquiel Morcella.
Morcella, yes.
Yeah, mm-hmm. Yeah, that looks like a really interesting paper. I'll read that someday, maybe. Okay, so the one thing I think is really noteworthy with your writing is you bring in a preponderance of scientific background, and you, like you said, you cite and you have basis for a lot of your ideas. But that takes a certain level of background. You have to enjoy looking through literature. You have to remember this stuff.
No, you don't.
No.
God,
well, tell me about that.
Part.
But you have a background in this. You have a PhD. How has that impacted your writing?
I mean, the obvious temptation is to say, well, it makes it makes me a harder science fiction writer. It sort of puts me up there with Asimov and Benford and all those other people with postgraduate degrees, and we write hard science fiction as opposed to the soft, squishy stuff that comes out of the humanities. I don't really buy that. I'm guessing Marty's not going to buy it either. I've become increasingly convinced that the hardness of science fiction and my scientific qualifications, to keep it to the question you're asking, is really more of a reflection of the reader's background than the writer's. When I was growing up, when I was in high school, Larry Niven was like the ultimate hard science fiction writer. But, a central premise of a number of his books was genes that code for luck. How does that work? How does something that codes for the construction of a protein change the laws of probability? He had, faster than light drives. He had human beings evolving as basically descendants of space aliens from the galactic core. I still think that Niven had a very good grasp of Darwinian principles. His aliens are some of the best out there. But my point is, it was hard SF for me then. Now that I have a PhD, it's sort of verging on fantasy. I think to some extent my qualifications when I write are more of a disservice than anything else, because I will write something and I will think, yeah, but what about the cytoplasmic membrane? Wouldn't cytokinesis take care of that before it even got in to infect the cell? And then I'll write or I'll send it off to old professors that I've had, and they will ask me these questions. And my reaction would be, geez, I never thought of that. And then my reaction is, And all those assholes who mocked me when I was in grad school for playing Dungeons and Dragons while they were trying to get published in Nature, they'd ask those questions, which is dirty little secret. At least half the reason I put peer-reviewed citations on the backs of my books anyway. It's to cover my ass against snooty academics who probably wouldn't be caught dead reading my stuff anyway. But anyhow, so I wrote a book called Maelstrom, in which I actually stopped the plot dead for, I think, a page and a half, describing how a 535 amino acid listeria lysis stereolysin analog could sort of get across the plasma membrane without triggering endocytosis and so on. And it's like something that 1 out of a million people would even think about, and that person himself probably wouldn't care. But it was like a page and a half of turgid, cement-like, plot-stopping exposition.
Why? Why did you do that, Peter?
Because I didn't want Brad Anholt and John Richardson to think I hadn't done my homework. And Brad Anholt, I think he died of a stroke 20 years ago anyway, so I shouldn't even be worried about that. So I do that.
It's because of your notes.
Yeah, well, I mean, I do like. It's great that the notes actually have inspired people to read up on stuff, and I think that's great. And it is kind of just a shtick. But you look at someone like William Gibson, who informed an entire industry, and he wrote Neuromancer on a fucking Olivetti typewriter, a World War II surplus machine. He had, I mean, go back and read Neuromancer now, and it's like, it starts off with Case, trying to hog. This is like the middle of the 21st century, and he's got 50 megabytes of hot RAM, which is this big black market item, right? And there's this one point where he's hacking into some AI, and he's getting his ass kicked, and he calls out, "Someone get me a modem!" and it's like, but it doesn't matter, because his vision, to some extent, his lack of expertise allowed his imagination to take flight in a way that grabbed people, and people went into the world and went into computer science and did not say, as Gibson was trying to tell them, dudes, we want to kind of avoid this. They all said, wow, we could make this happen. And one of the best scenes, one of the most compelling scenes to me in Neuromancer is a scene that would not even happen now. It's a scene when the protagonist is in an airport, and the AI calls him on an airport payphone. Like, he just happens to be standing at the payphone rings, he picks it up, and it's Wintermute trying to talk to him, and Case hangs up. For whatever reason, he's probably a little bit scared that this AI has reached out to him, and he walks down the gallery, and every payphone he passes rings exactly once and follows him. And that was, to me, such a creepy, wonderful scene. And it was obsolete the moment somebody came out with cell phones. So
would you say?
So I think basically, I guess what I think is great about my scientific background is that it has taught me respect for the process. It has allowed me to interrogate consequences in a way that perhaps I otherwise wouldn't have. But in terms of the accretion of facts that you sort of draw around yourself in the process of getting a degree, I think that's really more of a straitjacket I think it's more of a bug than a feature when it comes to writing science fiction.
So would you say, I mean, in some ways, when I go back and read some of the classics, I'm not that excited anymore. Even the ones that I read when I was younger, I'm just not that excited. I've read, especially over the past year with the book club, we've read so many newer books, and the writing's just getting better. I wonder sometimes if the classic books, or even if science fiction in general is going to be outdated constantly. As if 50 years what exists now is going to be outdated again. You mentioned Niven, and you actually, I think you said something about Niven being put to shame for Carl Schrader's first book, Son of Suns. I'm not sure if that's
Did I
correct or
say
not, but
that?
I'm pretty sure you said Niven puts Niven's world building to shame, something like that.
Yeah, no,
But
I do remember that. Yeah.
but do you feel that you adding so much more to I guess just the scientific fact to your books, that you're going to be set apart with the hard science fiction, that you might not be outdated in 50 years because what you wrote about was real? And when we read Ringworld, it's not real. I mean, of course, Dyson Sphere, sure, but that's about it. And it's not that exciting anymore. And books coming out nowadays and say, well, there's new science. Look at this. They didn't know about this at the time. And spaceships, they all thought we were using spaceships, but we all float in globes that travel light years. And
Yeah, I mean, I think that I fear that I'll probably stale date pretty fast in some areas. I mean, to some extent, it's already happened. There was stuff that I wrote about in Starfish and Maelstrom that I had set ahead to 50 years, to the middle of the 21st century. And some of that stuff was happening before those books actually came out.
Wow.
Like between the time, like I thought I had this really great idea about internet weather, internet storms, congestion of traffic and stuff that and then I sort of threw my Darwinian electronic wildlife in there and so on. And it turns out that there was actually a website, I don't know if it still exists, that actually plots internet weather. Like that's the exact phrase they use. They used deep sea submarine ecotourism is a thing now that I was still saying was sort of shiny and new in 2050. And that's why I basically, when I was writing Blindside, I thought, fuck this. I'm not going to get caught short again. I'm going to have us with ICANN and antimatter spaceships that can go out to the Oort, and I'm going to put it in like 2082. And at this point, we'll probably, all be dead before then. There does seem to be a degradation of our high-tech infrastructure. Like we can't even seem to keep our bridges up anymore. The population of satellites, at least last I read, maybe things have changed since, but satellites are falling out of orbit and not being replaced just because of various budgetary constraints and because people don't care. And because in some cases, people don't want things like the GEOS system studying or collecting data that would, for example, be relevant to climate change. So there is an ideological drive in some quarters to try and, suppress that kind of information. How better to suppress that information than simply allowing the tech that collects the data to wither and die? So I suspect at this point I was probably being way too optimistic. But then again, the point of science fiction is never to sort of nail the future. The point of science fiction is never to say, so if aliens land on Trudeau's lawn the day after tomorrow, one of my immediate reactions will be, fuck. Well, so much for alien first contact stories, right? But another reaction will be, so what? The point that I had in writing Blindside was not to say this is the hill I die on. This is how first contact is going to go down. The hill I just, what I was saying was, what if consciousness is a maladaptive trait? What would be the consequences of that? And that's basically what science fiction says all around. The science fiction doesn't say this is the way the future is going to turn out. Science fiction says, supposing that this particular linchpin event happened, or supposing this is what the world in the future is like, what are the ramifications? It's a sort of a scattershot Monte Carlo simulation where we're all getting together and we're throwing a million different scenarios out there. And every now and then one of those scenarios happens to hit a bullseye through random chance, and the press is all, oh, this used to be science fiction, but now we actually have cell phones that look like Kirk's communicator. But that's not the point of the exercise. The point of the exercise is to interrogate an idea. One of the best definitions of science fiction I read was that it's that form of literature explicitly designed to explore the impact of technological change. So you posit something that has changed, and then you explore how that affects society. So if somebody does an episode of I don't know, CSI Miami, and you happen to have a calendar hanging on the wall that says 2035, just because it's set in the future doesn't make it science fiction. There's a shitload of science fiction stories out there that take place in the future, but don't really interrogate anything. They don't really ask, if this were different, how would that impact society? Or if they do ask that, the answer is sort of a trivially obvious, well, we'd have spaceships and ray guns, but everything else would stay pretty much the same, and we'd still make pew pew noises, and there would still be cops, and there would still be drug addicts, and it would pretty much be the same as society is today, except with higher tech, which is a pretty boring and doubtless completely wrong answer. So I don't really mind if I stale date. I hope I don't. I think that the more scientific details I pour into any particular book, that increases the odds that I will stale date, because the thing about science is it's always self-correcting. Mm-hmm. You know, if I was writing a religious novel, that would be great. You have these eternal truths that never change. The whole point of a scientific hypothesis is to be disproven. So, and this is why I have this is why I have no patience for the mundane SF movement. I think that's the most profoundly anti-scientific attitude that you can take, that you cannot write a story that is not plausible by today's science. I mean, that implies that we know everything already, that there will be no further breakthroughs, that we're not wrong about anything, and that's just bullshit.
And that kind of jives with what you were saying, with that it's almost a bit of a hindrance to have a bit of an academic background, because you question that fantasy element, and you kind of describe this knife edge that you walk along, where if you fall on one side, you're too, it's too sciencey, too academic, and you fall on the other side, it's too fantasy. But yeah, I mean, you really need to bring in that fantasy element to explore that impact of technological change that you mentioned. And and it's either easy to get that wrong, but really great sci-fi does that walk along that knife edge on both sides.
Well, and I love that you also reference a couple papers in your notes from 2055 and from 2093.
Those are totally legitimate papers.
Totally legitimate papers. One to the Papal Authority, I think, and the other. But I kind of, I've been dreaming of that kind of science fiction, kind of wanting it for myself. What I've imagined is, I used to read a lot of pop science, right, like actual science books, but like for the popular mind. And what if somebody could write a book about science, but from the future, like just set 100 years and totally straight edge, here's a pop version of how we fly, to different galaxies these days, and just write it as science, and then give references, not just to like a couple things, but like the references would then kind of catalog the series of discoveries that would be necessary. So you're sort of creating a whole scientific, narrative about science that could be true, rather than a story, right? That might be in a world that could be true.
Well, I mean, a lot of people do that. Heinlein had his future history. If you look at Star Trek, back in the 70s and 80s, they were coming out with technical manuals and Star Trek timelines and concordances. And they tried to figure out if they even retconned Khan Noonien Singh's eugenics wars as this kind of secret war in which the Bhopal explosion of the Dow chemical plant was one of the seminal events.
Oh, wow.
But it was like one of those things that sort of happened under the radar, so that most of us did not actually realize that we were being ruled by Khan Noonien Singh. So there have been all sorts of attempts to do that, some more successful than others. But yeah, no, I do like that idea for sure.
Yeah.
But the problem is, whenever you pass a benchmark, like it was such a drag to get past 2001 and realize we were still stuck in low Earth orbit. It was always science fiction until 2001. Fuck.
Yeah.
It's the Conan O'Brien joke, right? The year 2000.
Yeah.
Right? Like, so I mean, maybe I don't know if you want to give anything away. Maybe we could look at it as like an act of like future copyright. But I mean, is there like that sort of out there idea and its subsequent impact that you're flirting with for your next story?
Well, one of the stories I'm working with now actually involves wormhole building life forms that live inside the coronosphere of a star, based on magnetic monopoles and cosmic strings and stuff. It's I could never have come up with the idea myself. Somebody just came up with it as something on archive that was essentially a paper on whether or not life could evolve in a star that I'm sort of playing with. That's kind of wild. The novels that I'm currently playing with now, well, there's Omniscience, which is the final version of the Blindopraxia sequence, and I was stalled on that for the longest time, but I've just finally figured out what the bicamerals are going to do at the end of it, so I now have something to shoot for. I have several different threads, and you may find Blind Sight and Echopraxia, one or the other or both of them, to be seminal works of great scientific genius, or you may find them turgid pontificating crap where I just spew a bunch of ideas out without much of in the way of a plot. But one thing you got to say is that both those books have a lot of ideas in them.
Yeah.
And I've got enough ideas. Plus, I think I've also got kind of an emotionally compelling plot to bring everything home. Cool. The one hint I can give is that there is a scene in Echopraxia where it is suggested that the thing coming back is not Siri Keaton. That when it keeps saying, because Blind Sight is essentially being broadcast in dribs and drabs through the solar system, right? And they're picking it up back on Earth. And it's kind of suggested that this thing constantly saying, imagine you're Siri Keaton, is not doing it as a literary affectation, but is actually something that's not Siri Keaton trying to act like Siri Keaton. So there have been two possible interpretations that people have hit me up with. One is that, Siri's coming back, and the other is that something else is coming back that thinks it's Siri Keaton. And I know what it is, and it's neither of those things. There is a third option that nobody has stumbled upon yet, and it also has a really I think strong emotional resonance with Siri's relationship with his dad. His dad's going to be a major character in the third book. The other novel that I'm working on is one that I've been trying to write since 2010. And you've probably heard it a million times because I've talked about it a lot. It's called Intelligent Design. And I wanted to write it in 2010, and it was to be set 10 years in the future. So there's going to be some serious upgrading of that narrative, but it's essentially, it starts off with a couple of CSIS agents grabbing this chronically unemployed ex-grad student trying to pay off his student loans off the west coast of Canada, and basically giving him an offer he can't refuse because he's the only person who got a job who got a degree in something called neuroecology. And the thing they want him for is that there is this disputed area. There is a rock up between the Yukon and Alaska. And because climate change has opened up mineral exploration as the ice caps melted, all of a sudden there's a lot of competition up there. And depending on whether you draw the US border around this side of the rock or that side of the rock, you get a huge triangular shape of, massive mineral riches that could belong to one country or the other. So there's a lot of dispute going on about that. And a Petro-Canada underwater wellhead has just been, as far as anyone could tell, attacked by two giant squid and destroyed. And that's basically the start of it, that there are apparently genetically engineered giant squid that somebody is using by remote control. And it goes on to play around with the idea of sentient money. A lot of the algos and bots and stuff, the flash crashes that have taken place in the stock market. I've got a good friend who's a retired investment banker who also does a lot of day trading, and I'm sort of leaning on him for a lot of the economic stuff. And it's kind of a far precursor to the Rifters trilogy, and that the last line is somebody's going to look into what the internet is turning into as a result of all the shit that's gone down in the book, and they're going to say, wow, that's a real maelstrom in there. And that's basically going to be the only reference to but it sort of shows how the world of Starfish and Maelstrom got started. Right. So I'm kind of working on that. The problem is it keeps getting scuppered by real life events. There's so much stuff now that I have to rework. There aren't going to be, 10 years from now, there's not going to be oil They're probably not going to be drilling for oil up there. Though whatever they're drilling for, I believe they will be doing it underwater. They won't be doing surface rigs because the weather up there is going to be just too tumultuous as a result of climate change. So,
but there will be remote controlled giant squids, so you're good there.
Yeah, that I think, I mean, DIY biology is really taking off, and I've figured out a lot of stuff about that particular giant squid. For example, it uses its kidney, it uses the ionic gradient in its kidney as a battery to support essentially a bioacoustic modem that allows it to report back to base.
Amazing.
but so much else has happened that now I've got to figure out, okay, what will people be mining in 10 years? Well, probably lithium for batteries.
Right.
Are there lithium deposits under the Arctic Ocean? I mean, I don't know. All this stuff everything's in flux, and I'd like to get basically it's a near future techno thriller. It's my shot at a near future techno thriller, but the near future keeps catching up to me. I'm also talking with Neil Blomkamp about doing some interesting related stuff. That might be a whole different. But it's, that's still at the talking stage, and it could be rights disputes because Blindsight's been optioned, and there are certain ideas that we would like to take in a different direction that might be covered in the Blindside option and so on. So it would be, I like to think of Neil more as the guy who did District 9 than the guy who did Chappie, but
for sure.
He is nonetheless, yeah, and Elysium was pretty good too, although I don't understand why they didn't just drop a bunch of those medical beds down onto Los Angeles just to keep people from constantly trying to break into their nice shiny spaceships. I mean, they had those things were to them about as cheap as bidets, right? I mean, every house had one, so why didn't they just? anyhow, the guy is an artiste, and he's got his own vision, and I have a lot of respect for the dude. And if something can, I haven't actually signed any NDAs or anything with the guy. Maybe I shouldn't even be talking about it, but we're going back and forth. I don't know if anything's going to happen, but it would be great if it did.
I'll text him and give him the good word for you.
Well, I absolutely agree that his style, especially from District 9, would be perfect for your work. That's how I feel all the time when I'm reading one of your books. Like, I don't quite know what's going on. Things are shaky. Things are moving fast. Something just happened. I'm a little confused. I'm a little excited. I'm a little scared.
Yeah, Marty, that's exactly the goal every author goes into when they're writing a book. Confuse the audience.
Confuse the audience, yeah.
Let them not know what's going on.
Abuse
the mark of success.
Yeah. Try to really get them to become the character.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it is. I think it is good to put yourself. I mean, if you are a baseline human being surrounded by trans and post-humans, and you understand everything that's going on, then you're not really dealing with trans and post-humans, because a lemur should not be able to understand what the pilot of an F-16 is doing.
For sure, yeah.
On the other hand, if I just throw a bunch of weird ass shit at the wall and it doesn't make any sense, and I say, well, of course it can't make any sense to your puny caveman brains because these are post-human, then I am guilty of like the mother of all cop-outs, right? I can just get away with anything and say, ooh, spooky post-human, nanotech, quantum. So it is a fine line to walk. I think Blindsight and Echopraxia are successful in their own ways. I think Blindsight was more successful at what it tried to do than Echopraxia was. I think there's a chunk in the middle of Echopraxia that I'm still not good enough to get right. But it was worthy in its way. But I think a problem with that was, you had Brooks, who was essentially a lemur surrounded by F-16 pilots. And I kind of knew what was going on, or at least I knew what could be going on. The way I tread that razor's edge is I don't pretend to know what the post-humans are doing, but I make sure that I always have 3 or 4 different possible agendas that would all be plausible and that would all fit with what happens in the plot. So on the one hand, I'm not saying, oh yes, I'm channeling a post-human and I know exactly what's going on. But on the other hand, I'm not just throwing shit at a wall. I have hypotheses.
So that's interesting. So you're really constructing a bigger. You're trying to do your best, also as a non-post-human author, to construct a story that's bigger than even you understand.
Yeah,
right.
But of course, the problem is ultimately the readers. I don't know if anyone can describe a post-human environment in a way that doesn't leave us cavemen confused.
Mm-hmm.
It may be a fool's errand. The closest I've ever seen anyone come to that was the light trip at the end of 2001: Space Odyssey.
Mm-hmm.
And even that was kind of crystal clear in the sense that, for my PhD, I would go out and I would catch harbor seals. And I would drive them back. I would dump them in a tank. I would stick radio transmitters in them. And I would bake them under ultraviolet lights and sun lamps and figure out their heat exchange rates and so on. The working title of my thesis was Max Headroom Reincarnated in the Body of a Harbor Seal. And it occurred to me that the experience that seal had, being scooped out of its natural environment, dumped in the back of a truck, driven through downtown Vancouver in the middle of the night with all the neon signs flashing, and then dumped into a little tank, which presumably is supposed to make it feel at home, but really is kind of wrong in all the right ways, is almost beat for beat what happened to the astronaut at the end of 2001. He was essentially a field mouse that got caught in a trap line and brought into a lab and dropped into a terrarium that was kind of supposed to look like his normal habitat, but didn't really.
Yeah.
And so even that, in a sense, was too comprehensible. Bowman got caught by was it Poole or Bowman who made it through at the end? It was Bowman. Yeah, Bowman essentially was trap lined and stuck in a lab. And that's a profoundly human, like we can understand that. Mm-hmm. Kubrick made it more confusing because he didn't have a narrator saying that was what was happening. He just showed it to us. And even so, a lot of people were absolutely confused by the end of 2001. They thought it made no sense at all. So I don't know. I mean, when one of the best filmmakers in modern history does something that actually is comprehensible, but presents it in a way that would be experienced by a regular human being, and gets dumped on for being confusing and pretentious and boring, I don't know what the hell business I had trying to portray post-human machinations from the point of view of a baseline human.
But I think you did create that context so that when the reader gets to those and they are trying to figure it out, those of us who enjoy that kind of thing are really saying, yeah, this is the way that it would be if I were baseline human, and there were all these other ways that the brain can be cut up and be thinking, and you can kind of problem solve your way through it. And the problem with that type of terse and dense ideation, which is what you're known for, is that it does alienate some readers. But then that's also why you're known for being an excellent hard sci-fi writer, is because for those of us that it really resonates for, that's why it resonates with us. We have to think about it. We really have to put a lot of time and effort into, pausing, reflecting, and even rereading. And I think that is a tricky thing, because it doesn't make you fully accessible to a lot of readers. But again, that's why a lot of people love it.
I just wish that really hard SF writer and really rich SF writer weren't at opposite ends of some spectrum.
Well, I was going to sort of object to the hard sci-fi things. I found the experience of reading your books is difficult and unpleasant, but I'm much edified for it at the end, right? The reward.
And in the one corner we have.
Well, you did ask me to bring my boxing gloves, so. But I've realized I reread Blindsight recently and sort of analyzed my experience of it and realized, like, well, you're actually just an amazingly literary writer for a scientist, especially. Like, I feel like a lot of the PhD overeducated sci-fi writers are also really boring writers, right? It's just exposition, and it's just kind of square. And I'm not going to name any names, but there's just something over sterile about that. Whereas your writing is extremely creative, and you certainly, achieve like an effect in the mind. You sort of take your reader and you shake them up, and you put them through an experience that's not just sort of about reading a bunch of scientific stuff. And yet at the same time, you're full of ideas, right? And there's a lot of cool ideas, and some of them, they're not quite hanging all together, but there's so many that I tend to fault myself for not understanding exactly all. And there's always more to find. So I think you walk.
Basically, saying I'm the Monty Python and the Holy Grail of science fiction. Like I'm coming out with like a zillion jokes that they don't all land, but enough of them do.
Sure, yeah.
Even if I pooch the ending, it's a very, very close Monty Python parallel there.
Nice.
Yeah, but no, I mean, I do pride myself on my prose, but the problem, and it's not just you; it's many people. My wife, who is a much better writer than I am, but she writes fuzzy fantasy, so she doesn't count. But she is actually she's much better at character development. Her prose is delightful. It's as eloquent as mine, but it's clear. You never get lost in it, or like you get lost in it, but you never get confused by it. And she points out that I have such a fondness for sort of metaphor and allegory and so on, but at the same time, I am talking about fictional and invented technologies, and it's a deadly combination. Because a lot of the time, people don't know whether to take me literally or metaphorically. Like when I say something, am I trying to be poetic? Is it purple prose? Or is that actually what they are observing? And I gotta plead guilty to that. I to some extent, I'm a bit of an arrogant asshole in the sense that the self-serving way to describe it is I don't want to talk down to my audience. I want to write something that I myself would want to read. But the flip side of that is I can just, I'm the same guy saying, well, no fucking handhold for you. If you can't keep up, you loser. And all I can say is the only way I can get over that and improve on that is to keep writing books. And the only way that's going to happen is if you guys keep reading them. So, Marty, here's the deal.
All right.
I will keep writing these things and I will try to make them clear. I'm actually surprised that was your main complaint, given that you're a physicist. I thought you would point out all the egregious physics boners that I had in terms of my telematter drive. But yeah, no, I am a work in progress, and my novels are a work in progress. And I just hope like hell that I haven't blown all my best ideas already on half-assed prose, so that, in 10 years from now, I will be the absolute master of science fiction stylist, and my writing will be completely clear and completely concise and utterly compelling, and I will have nothing new to say because I will have already said it in stuff that nobody could understand.
Well, don't worry, Peter. That wasn't actually my biggest complaint. I'm with James Nichol when I feel that whenever I find my will to live becoming too strong, I read Peter Watts. That it's not the clarity that's so bad. It's just the grim.
Something I love that quote. I love that
too.
quote, but I don't think.
But you have the beginning of your autobiography here. So.
I totally reject the characterization of me. On the one hand, I think you'll notice that I have smiled a lot. I have laughed a lot. I am a cheerful guy. I am actually, a lot of the stuff that people find really grim, I don't find especially grim. The idea that consciousness is a parasitic epiphenomenon is only bad news from the point of view of the system being infected. The tapeworm itself is quite happy to be a tapeworm. And if you say to that tapeworm, your body your host would do a lot better if you just flushed yourself out the anus and left it alone. The tapeworm would say, yeah, it probably could, but I'm not going to do that because I like being a tapeworm. I love being conscious. And to me, the idea that consciousness is parasitic. Well, it started off as just a conceit of punchline for a novel. I did not expect it to have the legs that it did. I did not expect to see actual neuroscientists starting to talk about the non-utility of consciousness. I did not start to see. I did not certainly didn't expect to see a backlash against the "we are all just zombies" contingent. But I really like being alive, and I don't think, So I don't think that conclusion. It's a kick in the gut. It is a real, it's a real gut punch if you happen to be one of those people that think that we are made in God's image and that there is something special about us. If you spent your entire adult life learning and studying and concluding that we're basically just mammals with far greater power, but our behavior, for all the self-serving rationales we spin around it, is pretty much the same as that of every other mammal. It's just a really interesting idea about us. And I like being a tapeworm, if that's what we are. I mean, I'm probably still wrong, but if I'm not wrong, it's still not necessarily a downer, because, tapeworms got a tape. And
I think you're right there, Peter. I'm on your side. You also quote Hemingway for Blindsight, and I'm probably going to misquote this, but it's along the lines of all men die like a dog.
You will die like a dog for no good reason.
For no good reason. And
I should probably point out before you go on that I was finishing up Blindsight at the time that my partner of 7 years had dumped me on my birthday over the phone. So if there was an element of grimness in certain elements of the closing parts of Blindsight, there may have been, but I actually thought that kind of powered the book. I thought it gave it more emotional.
Oh, for sure. I think it does, for sure. I think there's beauty in that, and I find I would disagree if someone says that is just a downer quote from Hemingway. I think that it's full of beauty, but I do need to ask: did you kind of write yourself into that character of?
I went through kind of a battle computer phase where I was not, as a result of certain aspects of my upbringing, I was hypersensitive to the idea of emotional manipulation. And for a long time, I couldn't really tell the difference between calculated emotional manipulation and somebody who is actually in pain. So my tendency when somebody got all wet and blubbery on me was to think, this is a trick. You are trying to, you're turning on the water faucets to try and get your way. And I would essentially shut down emotionally. And that was my phrase for it, was battle computer mode, because I was, I would still be, I wouldn't be angry. I wouldn't be abusive. I would just be very cold. And that scene where Chelsea is literally curled up on the floor and Siri just kind of turns away because it's just a trick, that happened. So yeah, scenes where Siri is an asshole are going to be more likely to be autobiographical, but again, they don't make me look good. So there's absolutely, the only reason that I'm telling you this is because I'm hoping that the people who listen to this will only be about 2 or 3 times as many people as are actually participating in this conversation.
Yeah, you got nothing to worry about.
Hey, we do like to read a little bit from the authors that we're talking about, and I just happen to have this passage marked. So, and I think it dovetails nicely with what you're saying. So, I think I'll just read half a page from Blindsight here. The butterfly was starting to fade. I'd never seen that happen before. Do you understand what I'm saying? She asked. Sure, I'm a fixer-upper. Siri, you wouldn't even get a tweak when I offered. You were so scared of being manipulated, you wouldn't even try a basic cascade. You're the one guy I've met who might truly, eternally be unfixable. I don't know. Maybe that's even something to be proud of. I opened my mouth and closed it. She gave me a sad smile. Nothing, Siri? Nothing at all? There was a time you always knew exactly what to say. She looked back at some earlier version of me. Now I wonder if you ever actually meant any of it. That's not fair. No, she pursed her lips. No, it isn't. That's not really what I'm trying to say, I guess. It's not so much that you don't mean any of it. It's more like you don't know what any of it means. The color was gone from the wings. The butterfly was a delicate charcoal dusting, almost motionless. That's a great piece of writing. Well done.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I almost feel like now like I'm a romance
I
novelist.
got that part.
Well, I would say that from that perspective, when we're going back and forth on this, I really do appreciate not being talked down to as a reader. And as you said, I like those mental gymnastics, and I appreciate them. So if I think I'm the voice of many of your fans who would say keep it up. And I'm looking forward to Omniscience when that one comes out, and other work that you're going to be doing. But I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about the Canadian connection before we lose you. Is you're a Canadian author, your wife's a Canadian author, you've been successful here. Can you talk a little bit about the Canadian context as a sci-fi writer? Is it different? Is it better? Is it worse?
I don't think I actually have made it here. I don't think, they say about a prophet in his own country. I don't think anybody in Canada really gives a shit about me.
Right.
Strangely, I mean, to talk about the difficulty of my writing, I've spoken to people who were like, in Romania and Ukraine, who, obviously English is not their first language. They're reading Blindsight, they're reading Echopraxia, and they literally have Wikipedia open on the screen so that they can constantly check for, people. For some reason, people in Eastern European, like Soviet occupied countries, really seem to like my stuff. They really seem to dig my stuff. But here in Canada, it's like, I don't even get the sense that there is a science fiction community so much in Canada. There's a lot of infighting. When I first moved to Toronto, there was kind of a lawsuit going on within the community. Rob Sawyer was being sued for what were frankly actionable. Basically tried to get somebody fired for writing a mixed review of one of his novels.
Oh my
and that
goodness.
kind of split the quote community down the middle to the point where people were explicitly counter-programming their parties at exactly the same time. So you'd have to pick a side as to which party you were going to go to.
Which side were you on, though, Peter? We got to know.
I was on Alan Weiss's side.
Okay.
And just, I don't know if you might have heard about it. I mean, you're science fiction fans. The Cheesian implosion of just a year or two ago.
I didn't.
Cheesian was an extremely well-respected small press. And some of Caitlin's books came out from them. Their cover art, they produced an absolutely glorious artifact. The writing was top-notch. The artwork, they had a guy called Eric Moore doing their art, and he was a professional writer who cut them and only them a real break on the right. So they got cover art that was way out of their league for a small press. They produced really good writers. Their advances were shit. They treated their writers like shit. They would go on vacations and not pay royalties that were owed. They were basically the mean girls of Canadian SF. And at some point, but people put up with it because, they were highly regarded, like, they were winning World Horror Awards and so on, right? They were a small press, but they were an extremely prestigious one. And then people started coming forward and saying, look, I was abused. I was and it really was kind of a cult. They would take somebody in as an unpaid intern and they would live with them. They would keep them in the basement and they would shit all over the previous intern. And they would, fawn over this particular person, groom them, and then start shitting on them. I mean, there was some real abusive. That entire coterie of people behaved monstrously to both their authors and to the people that were working for them. They very publicly and spectacularly imploded when all of this came out. There were some financial irregularities in terms of the grants that they were getting from the Canadian government and so on. And so that too is an example of something that has riven the Canadian quote community. I I myself have not been part of that community, I think, for some time. I mean, I was part of SF Canada for a bit, and it was essentially a sandbox where a bunch of people cried about, a lot of people with glass jaws would freak out if you criticized Netanyahu's policies towards the Palestinians and call you an anti-Semite. And it was just everything. Everybody had a glass jaw. Everything was petulant and small scale. So I let my membership in that lapse. And since then, and don't get me wrong, I think there's a lot of great people. There's a lot of great Canadian authors. And I am proud to, go down to Stormcrow Manor and hang out and have beers with them and get hammered. I'm proud to Zoom with them and collaborate with them and call them friends. Some of the ones that I am friends with, I am proud to call my friends. But I tend to see them one-on-one socially. I don't tend to see them in a group as a community. I don't tend to go to Canadian cons. All the cons I've been to for the past 10 years have been overseas. And of course, I'm not allowed into the US, so I haven't been to any of those either. And as I recall, when I did go to Canadian cons, there was always at least one or two panels every fucking con you went to on Canadian SF. What sets us apart from everyone else? And that gets really tiring after a while too, especially when the one thing that sets you apart is Canadian SF is more about man against the environment, and the US SF tends to be more triumphal and man against man. I think the same old cliches get trotted out. There's a self-infatuation or a sort of an obsession with what it is that makes Canadian SF special. And I think that kind of parochialism doesn't do the genre any service at all. I mean, William Gibson is a great author, no matter where he comes from. China Miéville is a terrific author. The fact that he's not Canadian is neither here nor there. I am at least an ambitious author.
Wow, Peter, you give us so much to think about. I love the ideas, and what a conversation. Hope you enjoyed it. We've got a surprise coming up soon. Peter's joining us again, but we are also going to have Neil Blomkamp on the show with Peter. What's the connection with the two of them? We don't know exactly. We're going to have to find out by talking to them, and you'll have to find out by listening. Thanks again for joining us. Until next time.